And with that, I'm going to call this meeting of the Community Service and Public Safety Committee meeting to order. And Zendaya, are we in compliance with FOIA?
Yes, ma'am, we are.
Will you please call the roll?
Certainly. Mr. Alfred?
Here.
Mr. Brown?
Here.
Ms. Bryson? And Ms. Becker?
Here.
All accounted for.
And do we have an approval or agenda today?
No, ma'am.
And so can we get an approval of the minutes from the regular meeting, April 17th, 2023?
So moved.
Call the roll.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Alfred?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
What?
Ms. Bryson? Ms. Becker?
Yes.
Motion carries.
And appearance by citizens. I see no one here joining us today, but Zendaya, is there anyone who had indicated they would be here?
No, ma'am.
And were there any messages or
No,
notes?
ma'am. No portal comments also.
Okay, thank you. Well, on to new business. And we'd like to welcome Jeff Purdy from the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office, Southern Enforcement Branch Commander, to the podium for a quarterly report.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
My name is Jeff Purdy. I'm a major with the Sheriff's Office. Like you said, the Southern Branch Commander over Hilton Head Island. It's good to see you guys this morning.
Nice to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, ma'am. This is just a short PowerPoint of the data that you guys have been provided. Try to make it a little more palatable. But before we get started, this is a picture of the Veterans Memorial Park over there at Shelter Cove. I think it's a beautiful site. And yes, ma'am.
Yes,
It was in the packet.
yes.
Agenda
I
packet.
received it.
Again, this is a photo of the Veterans Memorial Park. I just like to thank all the veterans. If there's any of them in the room, thank you for your service and for what you do for us. And again, I think that's a beautiful picture of what we have here on Hilton Head Island. And to get started with the report, we'll start with the crimes against persons. This is in your packets. We had one murder this quarter. Daryl Grant was murdered on the 16th of March. The last 2020, 2021, and 2022, we didn't have any in the first quarter. The aggravated assaults are down by 2, as you can see. Robberies are down, as well as the rapes. The murder investigation is still underway. We're still working on that.
Could you repeat what murder that was again?
Sir,
The murder, where and what was it?
that was right there at, right in front of the Oaks, right on 278, right there. You familiar with it?
Familiar with the area, yes.
So that was the murder we had this quarter. This is some of our investigative team, just to kind of let you know. On the left, you've got Lieutenant Callandine. He's our lieutenant over the Southern Branch. He helps me day in and day out. We work together. You've got Staff Sergeant Eric Angstadt. He's new to the investigative team here on Hilton Head. He just transferred in. Then you've got Staff Sergeant Doug Seifert. He's a local guy. I'm sure several of you are familiar with Doug. Then you have Sergeant Zachariah Cushman, Sergeant Seth Reynolds, and then our victims advocate, Staff Sergeant John Adams, just to give you a little bit about what you guys have here on Hilton Head, helping us with these crime reports and trying to put these cases together. The next slide, you have the crimes against property. As you look at the burglaries, it looks like the burglaries are up a few. The larcenies are down and the auto thefts are down. On these burglaries, I kind of tried to dig through these to see what, what's happening and try to figure out what we can do to help resolve these. 11 of those are residential burglaries, 8 are businesses. As I go through the residential burglaries, I found that several of them were garages that were left open that would constitute a residential burglary. 2 of them were a motorhome, and one of them was a fugitive that we were chasing that he was trying to evade us, and he ended up breaking into somebody's house, hiding from us, and we ended up picking him up on that. The businesses, a couple of them are unoccupied hotel rooms where people were kind of taking up residency in there, for lack of better terms, but they broke in there to stay in hotel rooms. One of them was at Chaplain Park where they did the burning there. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with that. They broke into the bathroom and stole out of that. That constitutes a burglary as well. And then the thefts, jump back over to the auto thefts. There were 9 of them. 5 of those were vehicles. A lot of them were keys are left in them. And the other 4 were like mopeds and electric type vehicles. And not on this, I thought it was important because it's something that we deal with day in and day out, not only here on Hilton Head Island, but throughout the county is auto break-ins. And if we can encourage the members of our community, encourage everybody here to promote locking your car doors. We had 32 car break-ins this quarter. 29 of them were unlocked. And the other 3, if you dig down into those, it's where people are leaving valuables in plain view, which are giving some folks some motivation to go and get them. But again, I go back to the 29 unsecured vehicles. That is a problem, again, not only here on Hilton Head and not Beaufort County, but the state of South Carolina, Southeast, and in the country. People leaving their cars open, they're vulnerable, and it's extremely difficult to make cases on these because we're limited with evidence as we move forward.
I have the last quarter of 2020.
I've got 183 and 113.
Copy I was given.
Our chart compares first quarter to first quarter, year after year, rather than this past quarter for the fourth quarter that Ms.
The
Bryson
difference
is
between the
referring
fourth
to.
quarter and this fourth
Yeah,
quarter.
increase from one quarter to another, which I think is important to note. And in total, crimes against property for the first quarter of 2023, 141. For the fourth quarter of 2022, 96. So,
I'll have to dig into that and get you an answer.
okay. I think it'd be helpful to know rather than, I mean, it's nice to know year over year, but I think it's helpful to compare where we were 3 months ago to just.
All right, I'm going to skip on to the next page. This is one of our canine handlers and our canine friend here. Just to recognize Sean Toomey, he's been promoted to sergeant this quarter. He and his dog have been out, they're out in the street helping us day in and day out. In addition to that, in July, by July 1, we're going to have another patrol dog handler here helping us on Hilton Head Island and throughout the county. We have training that's going to start in June, where a dog's going to be introduced to another handler, and he should be on the road ready to work for us July 1.
May I ask a question? So I love the fact that you're highlighting specific individuals within the sheriff department and certainly Nico. And we look forward to seeing the next canine. The question is, are these folks that use the Hilton Head Island County office as their main headquarters
Sergeant Swinehammer and Sergeant Toomey both, yes.
are
ma'am.
right here. So when they get called out of Hilton.
They work this area, but if they get called to Beaufort, they're going to go to Beaufort as well.
But they're here. Okay,
They're here. Those two are here, yes, ma'am.
thank you.
Actually, there's going to be a third one as well.
Look forward to seeing you.
And Toomey's been here for 9 years, assigned to the southern branch, pretty much Hilton Head. And Nico's been here 4 years with him. Switch over to the Rex. I know Mr. Alfred had mentioned last time we were out there with Major Vance, he had some questions about the Rex. I'm going to run through these, and these are first quarter compared to last year. The collisions are up a little bit with injuries and without. The hit and runs are down a little bit, and the fatalities are up. We had one fatality this quarter. January 15th, we had a pedestrian that was run over in the area of 278 up towards Parker's. 6-year-old man from Michigan was run over. It was late in the night. The driver that ran him over didn't see him till the last minute. It was dark and he didn't see him. Highway Patrol is working that wreck, but that's the information I can share with you on that one. Going back to, I think in 2022, we had 6 total fatalities. There was one also in the first quarter. 3 of them were pedestrian fatalities, and the common factor in those was darkness. 2 were run over and it was dark. One was at dusk. And then I think you questioned Major Vance about bicycles. Last year we had 1 bicycle fatality. Guy was run over. It was in the middle of the night. It was actually right at midnight. And then the other 2 fatalities from last year one was for speed and one was for DUI. And again, this quarter unfortunately we had 1. To jump back to the bicycles, this quarter we didn't have any bicycle accidents. Last year we had 9 throughout the year. There were 4 in the fourth quarter. 1 in the third, 1 in the second, and 3 in the first. To give you an idea, I think we talked about trying to provide a heat map or something for wrecks, collisions. It's extremely difficult, but if you start looking at the collisions in the report that you guys were provided, the majority of the collisions are on there. 278. I think there were 77 on 278. 278 is the issue. Second behind 278, it's going to be up Hoop Avenue through Palmetto Bay. That was the next highest, which was it's a busy area, but 278 is the key.
Madam Chair, if I could ask a question here. I think from what I understand from a lot of residents, they're concerned about a couple things with regard to vehicle traffic on the island. Well, maybe 3 things. One is the amount of vehicular traffic, but primarily it's speeding and running red lights. Now, I certainly don't expect you to be at every red light on the island, but can you help the community know a little bit more about what the Sheriff's Department does with regard to patrolling, especially 278, since that's where the heat map shows the accidents are? And because residents are concerned about how much are they paying and for what service. So can you help us out with that?
Well, traffic enforcement and speed is key on 278. I think that's a big issue. You've got the biggest problem that I see is you've got distracted drivers. You've got distracted drivers, you've got aggressive drivers, and then you've got your Sunday drivers. And then you mix that with people that don't know where they are. They're trying to make their quick turn because they don't want to pass the turn. I think we've got a lot of rear end issues. So, being out there and being present, I think, is the best thing that we can do. And we're out there and we're present. The tickets, the next screen is tickets and citations. The biggest thing is to educate people. Again, I go to your aggressive drivers, your distracted drivers, whether it be playing on your phone, messing with the radio, making a phone call, texting, emailing, putting makeup on, combing your hair. Those are problems that we deal with. Those are where our rear end accidents, collisions come into play. But going back to the speed and the traffic enforcement part of it, The numbers for the tickets, they're up. I think we had 406 tickets for the quarter last year. This year it's 509, so we've bumped those up a little bit. Our warnings are up as well. Last year we had 475, and this year we have 538. So we're out there as much as we can, and we're going to continue to be out there to be present, to be a deterrent, and to try to get people's attention. And again, I drive here every morning from off of Hilton Head, and the distracted driving, it is an issue. Again, you've got your aggressive driver compared to your Sunday driver, and those don't mix either. They cause problems.
The graph of the island that you had up a minute ago had black dots scattered all along 278. I kind of had the impression that the bulk of the auto collisions occur near the entrance to the bridge and in the area of the Oaks. That accurate or not?
When I looked at those numbers, the key intersections that I found on the 278 were there's Spanish Wells and Gumtree. Those were like 20-something of the 77 wrecks were right in that area. And then the second area is going to be your Palmetto Bay Road area, your traffic circle down there in that area.
Pine Circle area? See Pine Circle area?
Yes, sir.
Palmetto Bay?
Yep. And those are difficult areas. And then the third area, as I was trying to dig down into this thing, you got Squire Pope area, and that's way below. But the biggest is the 278 area, and the most popular area to wreck is from Gumtree to Squire Pope.
So one of the things that I see that you've included in the report, and thank you, because it really highlights what you've just described, is the chart that
Yes, ma'am.
indicates the areas and even the streets. And that is very helpful. If you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, you might find that document valuable. It's in the report. Right, it's not numbered, but you'll find it's easy to find. And I think that was a great addition. Thank you for breaking it down that way. It is surprising that it's not necessarily the areas that we focus in our minds as being worst of the worst. But clearly 278 is, there's accidents enough to share.
Go back to the heat map. Sorry, I made you jump ahead. Number of tickets.
Those dots are showing what?
Those are all the wrecks, the collisions.
Collisions.
Yes, sir. And if you look around the Sea-Pine Circle, the traffic circle, a lot of those outside of the circle, that includes parking lot accidents, fender benders in the parking lots. It includes everything. But again, the biggest number is 278 where the wrecks are. And we all know that that's the longest stretch of roadway, but it's also where the majority of those wrecks are.
Looking at that heat map, it looks, as I understand it, that's the airport at Matthews where there seems to be a lot of accidents, or a lot of black dots anyway. Is that accurate? You mentioned Squire Pope and Gumtree, but I didn't hear you mention that intersection at Matthews.
When I was trying to break down from the sheet that you got and looked at the biggest numbers, and the biggest numbers were showing at the area of Spanish Wells as far as specific numbers. These dots, they could be on top of each other.
So the Matthews still in road areas around 11 if you
I
go
don't
back
have
to the
that
chart.
either.
And this particular one I did not see. This slide is
I
not
don't
in our
think we have
report.
that. Can you
No,
make
that was
that?
added.
It might be useful. It sounds like folks are interested in seeing that distribution in that way. So would that be helpful?
But
Good.
the tables with the vehicle collision analysis, that's what we've seen before, so.
Very helpful. And thank you. The effort or the numbers on, which clearly a result of an effort, on tickets, both warnings and actual written tickets. The increase does indicate, at least to me, that more people are being told to change their behavior on the roadway, whether it's speeding or they're distracted driving. I wonder sometimes if I'm one of the Sunday drivers, I drive at 45 miles an hour and generally not anything more, trying to set the example and lead the way, but there are people who fly past me. Our speed limit is mostly 45, 35 miles an hour and 278. Just as a reminder to anyone who's listening.
Next, we'll jump over to calls for service. Calls for service are down. Our incident reports are down. Our arrests are down. Our traffic accident reports are actually down.
That's interesting. Do you have any sense as to why? Do you think perhaps the calls for service aren't as high as they have been in the past because short-term rentals have another place to make their initial phone call to with GovOS?
I don't know that. I've tried to think about why this number is decreasing. It decreased a lot from last year as well. And I think at a period of time we were looking at the COVID because it was countywide. It wasn't just Hilton Head. It was countywide. The numbers dropped drastically. And trying to put it together, I know we're short-staffed, so when we're short-staffed, we have less proactive stuff. But the actual cost for service, I'm not really exactly sure on that.
And we'll look at the numbers and think of what the trend might be or the cause and see if we can stimulate more of that good news.
I was curious to know if we had lower numbers of people coming to Hilton Head Island this quarter. I don't know. Town ordinances, we had 2 fleeing evades, a couple alcohol violations, and a loitering. I anticipate that will certainly pick up with the weather. It's going to continue to pick up probably through the second and third quarter and the fourth. And some of the things that we did, we've done engagements and events. On February 2023, the Sheriff's Office participated in a SWAT and bomb low country regional response team exercise. It was basically from Charleston to Ridgeland. We had agencies throughout the region, and including were Hilton Head Fire Rescue. Hilton Head Fire Rescue, they're our regional hazmat component of this team. And this team that we have, our regional response team, basically there's 7 of them in the state of South Carolina. We're a type 1 SWAT and bombs team in Beaufort County, and we cover not only Beaufort, but Jasper, Hampton, Carlton, Barnwell, Bamberg, and Allendale. But the interesting part about it is Hilton Head Fire Rescue works with us. They're the regional hazmat team, and the money that comes from Homeland Security that goes into this to provide these services to these counties also stays here in Beaufort County and Hilton Head. So when we have issues here, we've got this equipment and this training and expertise here. I just thought it was neat to let you guys know that we've participated in this event, and we're still waiting on our report. The preliminary report I received from folks that were there was exceptional on both the Hilton Head fire side as well as the Sheriff's Office bomb and SWAT side. So those guys are doing well. Just a little bit about what we're doing here. The next one is, I think somebody asked last time about engagements and events. On the left, you've got Staff Sergeant Cypher. He's doing a presentation at Hilton Head High School, working with those kids, young men and women. On the right, obviously, we had the St. Patrick's Day Parade. It was a success. We brought 31 deputies in that were off duty just to work the parade specifically, and it went off without a hitch. I don't believe we had to make one arrest. And of course, the weather may have been a factor in some of that, but it went off very well. I think everybody was pleased with it. And this is another event that we did at the Working Dog, the Sandbox Museum. The Sheriff's Office got 2 new bloodhounds for tracking fugitives. You've got Rufus and Molly. Those are actually 2 different dogs. They're extremely friendly. They're kid friendly, and they were carried out to the Sandbox Museum to interact with the children. It'd be nice to have some pictures of that in here, but because they are children, we can't, so that's the best we can do. But that was a very good, successful event. And that would be our report.
way to end. Molly and Rufus are adorable, and in some of ours world, now that our children are grown, and we've got grandchildren not close by, our four-legged family members are certainly cherished. And on Hilton Head, I think they're pretty special for everyone. Very nice. Are there any questions?
I just want to thank you, Major Purdy. Very good presentation.
Alex?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Purdy. The report, well done. This slide's got my attention here. I guess the question is, were Molly and Rufus, in the visit to Sandbox Museum, was that initiated by the Sheriff Department or by Sandbox?
I don't have the answer for you. I know Major Vance was very involved in that. I'll have to ask her and I'll get back with you.
Sure. I just want to make a couple observations. Councilwoman Becker and I were invited to Sandalwood this past week, and I appreciate the Sheriff's Office being there, participating. I thought the discussion was good. But the one thing I noticed, well, two things I need to point out. One, Sandalwood has converted one of their units to a community center right next to a playground. Sheriff's Office that members that showed up to that meeting were initially at the Sandalwood Management Office, which is a totally different building, okay? And I guess I want to make that point that in an area where generationally we've seen a lot of crime, most recently with Mr. Dow Grant's murder, I guess the community members that I spoke to had some disappointment that the Sheriff's Office did not know where the community center was.
Okay.
All right. And the dogs are really taken out to me because there were a lot of kids just outside of the community center's doorway on the playground that were very interested in the meeting. And I'm thinking because the officers were there and, you know, they had their guns on the side. And in this day and age with the type of games that our youngsters play, unfortunately, video games, there's a lot of gun activity, okay? And I can see in these children's eyes their fascination with guns on the side of these officers. I just feel like we could have had a shift there if maybe we had Molly and Rufus there instead, right? So I just say that those opportunities, I think we can just do a little bit better job as far as how we show up as community members, as law enforcement, okay, versus just with the guns, if that makes sense to you.
Yes, sir.
And if I may just follow up on that, because it was, first of all, thank you to the Beaufort County Sheriff's Department for showing up and in force. There were a number of people there from the office, and I thought that that was a good representation. I have pledged to help them arrange some programming there, and perhaps the invitation of having Rufus and Molly out at an event would go a long way, to your point, Alex, with having set it up ahead of time so the children can understand and hear and learn and meet their friends at the Beaufort County Sheriff's Department who they know they can count on anytime. So we're going to work towards that and certainly hope that we can invite Molly and Rufus out there to join us. That's it.
Yes, thanks again for your report. And as I indicated, I think a lot of our residents are concerned about speeding and folks running red lights. I think it might be helpful when you make another report to tell us about what, if any, efforts have been made to address those concerns on the island. And then the second question I have, and I'm not sure, Major Purdy, if you're the right one to ask this to, but this is the only time I know I've been able to ask this question, and that is that in addition to those kind of concerns, residents are concerned about expenses. And so I don't know when and where the Sheriff's Department makes a report to the Town Council about where the money goes that goes to the Sheriff's Department. You know, how many how many folks do we have here? What about, patrol times, any kind of general information so that we can correlate. Here's how much money is spent versus here's the service that we're getting. And I think we need to look at some sort of reporting. I don't know whether that belongs with Finance Administrative or whether this committee, but I think we need to hear from the Sheriff's Office about where the money's going.
Thank you, Patsy. Well, thank you so much for joining us for the comprehensive report. We appreciate all of the efforts that Beaufort County Sheriff's Department across the county, but certainly here on Hilton Head. And we look forward to seeing you again here and in some of the community events. I think when your presence is known and felt, all of our crime statistics ultimately will be impacted by that. So thank you. And with that, are there any other comments from the audience? I think we have Chet in the room. Do you have any comments or just listening? Well, thank you for joining us today. And so, Zendaya, do we have the need for an executive session today? And that need is to discuss a discussion of personnel matters pursuant to the South Carolina Freedom of Information Act, Section 30-4-70A1, and it's related to the town council appointments to boards. It's related to the town council appointments to town boards, commissions, and committees. And there are 4 listed: Accommodation Tax Advisory, Board of Zoning Appeals, Parks and Recreation, and Planning Commission. Is there a motion?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
All those in favor, please raise your right hand. Thank you very much.
Fort Fremont closes out a 350-year legacy of coastal fortifications in Port Royal Sound, beginning in the mid-16th century. It also represents the closing chapter of America's coastal defense system before the dawn of air power. Fort Fremont is an example of the most advanced military technology of its time. It would parallel the B-17 and aircraft carrier of World War II, the F-35 of today. Fort Fremont was an important part of the Beaufort culture, very similar to Parris Island and the Marine Corps Air Base today.
In 1525, the Spaniards named this sound and this harbor Santa Elena. They called the navigational point La Punta de Santa Elena, the point of Santa Elena. And what the Spanish explorers discovered is that Port Royal Sound is a unique piece of geography. It's the deepest natural harbor south of the Chesapeake Bay, possibly south of New York. The channel into Port Royal Sound, this I find a remarkable geological fact. The channel has not changed for 500 years. There's no inlet on the southern coast that hasn't shifted entirely in 500 years, except Port Royal Sound. There's something geologically different, or one might say magical, about Port Royal Sound. So Spanish sailors, being the best in the world in their time, found this place very early, knew that for the Spanish explorations of the American Southeast, this would be the entrada, the entrance. And so they built a city across the river, across the sound from where we are on Parris Island. It became the first capital of Florida. And they explored the backcountry from this location for more than a century with the object of building a highway from this magnificent harbor to Mexico City. So the Sound was known to the Spaniards. It was known to the French, who actually got here first and created the first Protestant colony in the New World on Paris Island over my shoulder. And that colony was a failure. The Spaniards replaced them. It was part of Spanish Florida when the English arrived 150 years later. And this became, as a consequence, a battleground in the 18th century between Spanish interests in Florida and St. Augustine and the English colony in Carolina and in Charleston. And back and forth these wars went, many of them naval wars, many of them employing, as all the sailors knew by then, the magic of Port Royal Sound. When the Civil War came, Confederates defended the harbor, but it was basically indefensible against large naval forces. So the U.S. Navy made it their principal target during the beginning of the Civil War and sent the largest flotilla of ships assembled by the United States Navy in the 19th century into Port Royal Sound on November 7th, 1861. In a 4-hour cannonade, which would have been deafening from where we're sitting, was heard for miles from Savannah nearly to Charleston. It was called the Day of the Big Gun Shoot. During the Civil War, this harbor that we're looking at was filled with ships. There would be hundreds of ships in this harbor. There was a 1,000-foot dock with a railroad on top off of Hilton Head. The military installation was mammoth. There were 13,000 U.S. soldiers on Hilton Head, which we're looking at. The largest population on Hilton Head until 1974. So this was a major U.S. government installation in the heart of the South. It was the headquarters of the U.S. Army Department of the South, but more importantly, it was the headquarters of the United States Navy South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. So the biggest ships in the Navy were here. And so it became, and that's really where the story of Fort Fremont starts, with that huge Civil War military operations and installations on Hilton Head, on St. Helena Island, on Paris Island, and in Beaufort.
After the Civil War, we're going to see a massive change in technology that's going to revolutionize the military. During the Civil War, we had ironclad ships, we had rifled cannons, but they were all made out of iron, and they were not terribly effective. But its technology is going to change after the Civil War. We're going to see steel produced, and steel is much harder. So now we have a new material to make armor out of for ships. So we can have these armored ships made with steel that are much more resistant to shot. Because I have steel, I can make stronger barrels for my guns. I can rifle and machine these much better, and the rifling is the spirals that are cut in the barrel that allows it to shoot further with more accuracy. And we can also now have breech loading guns that can lock from behind, so I can load my gun from behind. I don't have to go have the old black powder muzzle loading cannon I had before. Now I can fire much more rapidly. If I compare the gun of 1890 to the guns of 1860, for the same caliber, the same diameter gun, the 1890 gun will be able to fire a projectile that's 4 times heavier, can shoot it 3 times further, can put it in with greater precision, and can put it through much more armor than anything we had in the 1860s. It's a world difference. A military historian, E.R. Lewis, would say that the change between the Civil War and 1890 in artillery technology was the greatest that would be seen since the invention of artillery in the 14th century to the introduction of the nuclear projectile in the 1950s. So there's been a huge change in gun technology. At the same time, it's not just the steel, but also the powder that fires these guns is different. We have new chemical makeup, and sort of like cordite is invented now, and it's still a widely used military explosive even today. Smokeless powder is invented during this period of time. And it's not just chemical composition, but it's the details of how you make the grain, how fast they burn. So much like the skill of firing a solid rocket, solid fuel rocket, it's that same kind of technology that's been developed in these gunpowder and this new powder. So our weapons of this day are much, much greater. They would be the great killing machines of World War I. Most of the casualties on the battlefields of World War I would come from artillery. So the world has seen a huge change in artillery, and that's tied into changes in ships. We now have steel armored ships. They're all steam powered. They are now equipped with these fine long-range guns, and they now become the dominant threat of the late 19th, early 20th century. This is the threat. The French and English would bombard cities like Cairo and reduce them to rubble because they were unable to defend them. So this is how the world was seeing the threat from this new technology. Big battleships are the threat of the era, and new guns and fortifications on the ground are what you have to defend against them.
One of the most important and first things that happened after the Civil War is they built a railroad to Port Royal Sound, which didn't exist. It was the first connection of the Sea Islands to the mainland. And the advantage of that railroad is it brought coal to Port Royal Sound. So when the coal was delivered, the Navy followed.
In 1872, Robert Smalls was in the South Carolina legislature, and he pushed through a resolution to the Secretary of War calling for them to put a Navy station on Parris Island. And eventually he would go on to Congress, where he would continue his support for a Navy station here in the Beaufort-Port Royal area. They eventually opened a Navy station here and a coaling station.
They created in the 1890s on Parris Island the largest dry dock in the United States. This is the period when the U.S. Navy was switching from sail to steam. All the navies of the world need a coaling station. This was the principal coaling station, because of the railroad, for the Caribbean and South American U.S. fleets.
This would be the biggest dry dock south of Norfolk. In fact, it is the only dry dock south of Norfolk, Virginia, that's capable of taking these new modern battleships and these new modern armored cruisers. So this becomes, at this point, a strategic Navy base in that it provides coal, and it provides top-line support to the ships, and they can repair the hulls of even the biggest ships in the U.S. Navy. Following the Civil War, national strategy and emphasis in the United States shifted to recovery from war, and all of our coastal fortifications went into neglect. The military was busy taming the West, and coastal defenses became something that was no longer important. In the rest of the world, technology is moving forward, and they're developing these battleships, they're developing new high-quality artillery, and this is going on worldwide. And in 1885, President Grover Cleveland appointed the Endicott Board. This was headed by Secretary of War Endicott, William Endicott, and the board would meet and issue a report in 1886, and they said that the conditions of our coastal defenses were just unbearable. They cannot be allowed to stay like that. And they made recommendations for fortification and improvements. They identified 29 places that needed fortifications, and 11 of which were critical. In that list of 29, Savannah and Charleston are on the list, but Beaufort is not on the list. It'll take international events to bring Beaufort into the play of modern fort technology.
So the USS Maine was here on patrol and in the harbor, and while they were in the harbor several times, they entertained the local population. So the merchants and the social leaders and the political leaders of Beaufort were invited to come have lunch with the captain of the ship, Captain Sigsbee. And the officers got to know the people got to know the officers. The crew, which was large, would go ashore on payday and make friends with everybody in town. So it was a very social arrangement between the towns, Port Royal and Beaufort, and the ship. So the Maine left here. It went and reprovisioned, it refueled in Key West, and then went the 90 miles across to Havana into the harbor and blew up.
This inflamed the already hot passions both in Cuba and here in the United States. At that point, somebody in the War Department realized that we had this big dry dock, the only dry dock in the South that could take on and repair these big capital ships that were in our Navy. We were going to start operations against a power in the Caribbean, and this fort was totally undefended. And that's what put Fort Fremont on the map. We had to have a fort here to defend the coaling station, and especially this big dry dock, as well as this fine harbor that's here.
And of course, that event, which killed 300 or more sailors on the ship, was very much followed by the local news media and very much lamented by the many friends that the crew had made here. The destruction of the USS Maine was a personal matter to Beaufort and to Port Royal Sound. And of course it was the Spanish-American War and the attempt to defend this harbor again, which led to the creation of Fort Fremont. The United States declared war on Spain in April 1898.
And by early May, we had temporary batteries in place here, submarine mines were in place, and in the summer they would actually place the mines across the Beaufort River behind me. The temporary batteries were a temporary expedient. They were located to my left about 1,000 yards. They immediately began construction of what would become Fort Fremont. The large batteries would house the large guns. Battery 4 Nance, the rapid-fire guns, the smaller battery, was completed by June of 1898.
In 1898, everybody in town went to war. They had a naval militia unit, South Carolina Naval Militia Unit, and they were absorbed by the Navy. Many of them ran tugboats from here to New York to Key West, which was the principal support base, Tampa and Key West, for the U.S. Army operations in Cuba.
Peace was declared by the end of 1898, and the remainder of Fort Fremont would not be finished until early 1899, and the first soldiers would arrive from the regular Army at that point in March 1899.
Well, Fort Fremont was named for Major General John Fremont. He was actually a local boy, so to speak. He was born and grew up in Savannah, Georgia, just south of us, and went to college in the College of Charleston, up just north of us in Charleston. He served in the Army, and primarily initially as a explorer, as Army forts were generally named for Army officers, and he was connected locally. This is more than likely why the fort was named for him.
The fort was constructed on a site directly across the river from the Parris Island Naval Station. And the site selected was 170 acres, which included the two artillery batteries. Fort Fremont, of course, had Battery Fornes and Battery Jessup. But then adjacent to the battery site was an administrative quadrangle, a very typical military-type administrative square.
We are sitting in the number 3 gun position of a 3-gun battery, Battery Jessup, which had 3 10-inch disappearing carriage, large caliber guns, breech-loading guns. Their purpose was to engage the warships that might be entering the harbor and Port Royal Sound. We're here now at the 2nd battery that was part of Fort Fremont. This is Battery 4 Nance, was named for Army officer that was actually killed during the Spanish-American War during the Battle of San Juan Hill. Battery 4 Nance mounted 2 British-made 4.72-inch Armstrong quick-fire guns. They were called quick-fire because they were loaded with a complete cartridge, and in time of action they could fire 4 to 6 rounds per minute. The purpose of Battery 4 Nance was to defend the minefield, which was the other component of the Endicott Coast Artillery or Coast Defense System. A minefield with controlled mines, controlled meaning that they were connected electrically to shore and could be fired on command from shore. That control station would have been probably shared with the plotting room. And in order to protect the minefield, obviously an enemy would want to interfere with that, might send vessels, small ships in here at night to try to interfere. And this battery would take those vessels under fire if there was there was suspected that they were doing something to interfere with the mines, such as pulling up the cables and cutting those.
The Endicott era fort was a formidable technology. It represented state-of-the-art technology, defense technology of its time against the state-of-the-art threat, which would be the battleship.
The life for the soldiers at Fort Fremont was disciplined and regimented. They even had meal times were specified lengths of time, 15 minutes for lunch, 15 minutes at breakfast, 20 minutes at supper. They had to practice their skills. They were training and doing maintenance constantly. If you can imagine, with these big guns, they had to have skills and practice the skills in artillery, mine laying, signaling, which involved, in our case at Fort Fremont, the use of the fire control tower, which was a pretty sophisticated and advanced signaling technique. Then they also had to practice the typical military skills, marching and drilling, small arms fire, first aid, and so forth. In addition to that, they also participated in athletics. They had physical training, PT, and they also had sports teams. So this was to keep them physically fit so that they could continue their duties, because it was pretty rigorous at Fort Fremont.
When eventually the decision was made to move the dry dock and the coaling station and the Navy station up to Charleston, then this fort no longer became significant. There was nothing left here that was to be protected. And at that point, 1911, the last troops were transferred out and the fort was closed.
In 1901, the mayor of Charleston and the United States Senator Pitchfork Ben Tillman from South Carolina wanted this to move from Beaufort County to Charleston County, because there are more votes in Charleston County, and the mayor wanted the U.S. Corps of Engineers and the Navy to dredge the harbor in Charleston, because battleships in those days required 26 feet of water. Charleston's natural harbor is 15 feet of water. Port Royal is 30 feet of water. In order for Charleston to sustain its port, its commercial port, it had to dredge the harbor. Well, if they could get the Navy up there, they get the Corps of Engineers to dredge the harbor. That was the play. And the play for Pitchfork Ben Tillman, the U.S. Senator in 1900, was that he'd get a whole lot more votes from the largest city in South Carolina. So it was a political, commercial operation, and they moved the nation, and it was done, boom, like that.
The fort did its job. It was a deterrent for anybody that wished to attack these. It provided protection. In fact, the whole Endicott system, although never challenged in this era here in the United States, provided some 300 major guns, coastal guns, to protect major areas, and left the United States at the beginning of the 20th century with as well-defended coastline as any place in the world.
But I would just like to say that it's a magnificent artifact of an era. And it's an era that has been neglected. The turn of the 20th century, the naval station across the river here. And so it's a piece of history that's disappearing, and the Friends of Fort Fremont and Beaufort County have preserved it for the use of the public and as a memorial to that moment in history.
Fort Fremont closes a 350-year story of homeland security addressing European imperialism in the 19th century. It's a tale of how geography, technology, and national security creates a transition for America to become a global power. It's also a wonderful snapshot of America in the beginning of the 20th century. The Friends of Fort Fremont and Beaufort County have a valued partnership working in tandem to preserve the fort's integrity and promote the historical, natural, and cultural aspects of the fort. Most important, we are always looking for creative ways to enhance the visitor experience.
It's civilization versus nature's fury. Raging blizzards bury cities under thousands of tons of snow. Howling hurricanes tear apart coastal communities with wind and rain. And flash floods wipe entire towns off the face of the earth. As the skies clear, people begin to pick up the pieces. But after the storm, insidious damage is still being done. Our most vital natural resource is under assault, our nation's waters.
We're at the Chattahoochee Nature Center, and we're trying to find out what a watershed is. First victim. I need you to tell me what a watershed is. Do you have any idea?
Watershed? A watershed? Where people go to the bathroom? Sweating, I guess.
Something to do with sweating?
Uh-huh.
Like after you run, when
You perspire, yeah.
and then you shed it?
Uh-huh.
We wanted to ask you if you knew what a watershed was.
A watershed?
Yeah.
Is it kind of like the rain?
Do you know what a watershed is?
Shed that holds water.
Come here for a second. I want to ask you something. Do you know what a watershed is?
No. No.
Do you have any idea? What do you think it has something to do with?
I don't know.
What a watershed is?
Yeah.
That's just a drain pool, I guess you'd say, or the drain area. That's where the rainwater drains into the river.
Correct. That's a great answer.
A watershed is that area of land that drains to a body of water, be that if it's a river, a stream, the ocean, an estuary, a bay. Wherever you live drains to some water body, and you live in a watershed. So everyone lives in a watershed.
And in this modern industrial age, our water sources are becoming more contaminated with each passing year.
The biggest water quality problem that we have in the nation today is polluted runoff.
All water east of the Continental Divide drains to the Atlantic, while water west of the divide flows to the Pacific. And one drop of rain can cross many different watersheds along the way. As runoff flows into rivers, streams, and storm drains, the water picks up trash, dirt, bacteria, toxic chemicals, and fertilizers, creating a soup of pollutants that is extremely hazardous to the environment. And the consequences of polluted runoff exist worldwide.
The UN estimate is that there's about 1 billion people on the planet right now who don't have adequate access to fresh water.
97% of all water on Earth is salty ocean water. Of the remaining 3% that's fresh, over 2/3 is frozen in glaciers and polar ice. That leaves less than 1% of all the planet's water for our use.
I predict in the future that some of the U.S. water needs are going to come through pipeline because we have just overused our supply.
To address the complex threats facing U.S. water resources, the Environmental Protection Agency recommends adopting a watershed approach.
We're trying to reconnect some of the river.
It's a method that looks at each watershed for its own unique set of environmental challenges and solutions.
In many cases, people mistakenly identify large discharge pipes in the water as the problem. But that may not be the problem. It may be coming from agricultural runoff. It may be coming from stormwater runoff over parking lots and impervious surfaces. Every watershed is different, and you need to look at each watershed in its own terms and then think systematically about how you remediate, how you clean up that watershed.
In California, the Santa Monica Bay watershed drains a dangerous amount of polluted runoff after each storm.
When it rains, literally the whole residue of urban living ends up getting washed into the storm drain system and ends up going straight into the bay on Santa Monica Bay's beaches with no treatment whatsoever.
It's actually like a giant toilet flushing because all of the pollution, the dog mess has been building up and building up and building up. When it rains, it just flushes into the storm drain and goes directly into the surf.
In 1996, the Santa Monica Bay Restoration Commission proved there was a link between the contaminated runoff in the Santa Monica Bay and reports of illness afflicting people who swim there.
What we did find was at the outlets of storm drains, no matter where they were up and down the bay, if there was a flow of runoff into the surf zone, those people that were swimming in those areas definitely experienced higher incidences of illnesses.
The pollutants in the water affect surfers because we're actually the indicator species with all the pollutants. When we are in the waters, we're ingesting it through our skin and our mouth. Even if people don't take a swallow of water, it's still getting into our systems, our ears, any orifice on your body. And it causes infections, it can cause colds, sore throats at the very least.
I wouldn't want to swim in water that's got those diseases in there, just floating around, making more diseases.
I've seen it pretty much as bad as it can be. I've seen crap floating out in the water, literally.
Generically, we call it fecal coliform. More specifically, you might know of it as E. coli, salmonella, or enterococcus. Whatever's in poop.
There's times when it tastes funky, for sure.
Every day, the city and county of Los Angeles perform a battery of tests to keep the public informed about water quality in the Santa Monica Bay. Cesar Arzadan begins the monitoring process each morning by taking a series of coastline water samples. Then it's back to the lab for analysis.
Most of the bacteria that you're going to see, it comes from feces. And when you put it under the UV light, you're going to see a different kind of color. It's a fluorescent sign that there is a bacteria, and that one is called E. coli. That one definitely is feces from animals, or it could be humans also.
The results are reported to the health department, and beach warnings are posted as necessary.
The number of beach postings has decreased, and 85% of the beaches that have been monitored in California have received either A or B grades, and that's significantly different than 4 years ago.
But while progress is being made in California, the harmful effects of polluted runoff are a growing concern everywhere. So what can the average person do to help reduce pollution in our watersheds?
How you apply pesticides or not in your garden, how you wash your cars, making sure that you don't throw cigarette butts out onto the street.
Do not dump things on the ground, especially oils or any chemical pollutants. Pick up after your dogs. A lot of people don't realize how important that is. And just be a conscientious citizen and don't leave anything on the ground.
I think one person can make a difference and needs to make the difference. If not you, who?
Coming up.
We're heading for what's known as an ecosystem collapse.
Can the Gulf of Mexico be saved from polluted runoff? It was a flood of apocalyptic scale. 26,000 square miles of the lower Mississippi Valley inundated by water. More than 200 lives lost, and 600,000 people displaced from their homes. The flood of 1927 was the most disastrous in U.S. history, and its effects are still felt today. After the flood of 27, massive levees were put in place. And while they helped protect the lower Mississippi River basin from flooding, the levees and other human activities would ultimately harm the watershed in unforeseen ways. The Gulf state of Louisiana is the terminus of the Mississippi River, the mighty watershed that drains 41% of the area of the lower 48 states into the Gulf of Mexico.
We receive water from as far away as Montana, Michigan, to Pennsylvania, Ohio, Iowa. All those waters drain right past this area right here.
But by the time all that water enters the Gulf, it has accumulated enough contaminants from polluted runoff to create an enormous hypoxic zone, an area of water lacking in vital oxygen.
The size of the low oxygen zone in the Gulf of Mexico is about 9,000 square miles. That's equal to the size of the state of New Jersey.
The shortage of oxygen is killing fish and other sea life and could potentially have a devastating effect on the regional economy.
We are the largest navigation port in the United States. We are the second largest in the world. We have the largest fisheries in this country.
When we was crabbing, a lot of times all our crabs we dead and we can't even sell them.
The reason hypoxia should be of concern to most citizens in this nation is because it's a sign. It's a sign of the degradation of our water resources.
We're heading for what's known as an ecosystem collapse.
If you're going to have an ecological disaster caused by the offshore hypoxic areas, then that absolutely translates into an economic disaster.
So what exactly is causing this dead zone in the Gulf? Hypoxia develops when an area of water receives excess pollutants, primarily an overabundance of nutrients, which produce large algae blooms that die off and lead to low oxygen. And since the Mississippi gets fed by tributaries that flow through 31 states, that adds up to a staggering volume of contaminated runoff.
You have drainage into the Gulf of Mexico from the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, and the Missouri River. Yet each of those three major river systems are watersheds in and of themselves with their own challenges and their own problems.
The Mississippi River has always delivered a lot of water, and that hasn't changed over the centuries. What's changed is the amount of nutrients in that water.
In fact, the Mississippi's nitrogen levels in the lower Mississippi River have tripled since the 1950s. And the growing hypoxic zone off the Louisiana coast contains the disturbing evidence.
It's like a rusty color, stanky, rotten looking. You see fish just swimming sideways, gasping for air and stuff like that. And when you pull up the nets, not one shrimp alive, all dead, orange. The fish, they rotten, like melting away and stuff like that. Can't breathe stuff, and it's just rotten.
This is just a fact of life, the way we treat our water systems, because we use them as our garbage dumps. We use them to dilute our pollutants and things like that, and it flows downstream. I believe the statistic is that if you're in New Orleans, the water that is going by you has passed through a human gut something like 3 or 4 times before it gets to you.
Incredibly, Louisiana boasts a natural resource that removes pollutants from the draining Mississippi, the once abundant wetlands.
Plants that grow in wetlands produce these wonderful filters for everything that is coming into them. They trap sediment, they tempt chemicals, and what leaves the wetlands is much, much cleaner water.
Wetlands also provide an important habitat for birds and other wildlife. Sadly, the Louisiana wetlands are quickly disappearing.
Coastal Louisiana has lost about 1.2 million acres of wetlands in the last 100 years.
When we levied off the Mississippi, it cut off the Mississippi River water from the marshes.
In addition to the levees, a network of man-made navigation channels is also compromising the wetlands by allowing salt water to seep into the marshes.
Once that salt water travels up these channels and overflows the banks of these channels out into freshwater systems, such as this cypress swamp, that salt water sits out there around the roots of these trees and kills them. They cannot survive salt water. They're freshwater plants.
Eliminating the hypoxic zone will take more than saving our wetlands. Reducing nutrient runoff in the Mississippi River watershed is the heart of the problem. It's an issue involving over half the states in the nation and a vast array of industries, particularly farming, which uses nitrogen-rich fertilizer to grow its crops.
Fertilizers are helping the United States produce the food for the world, but there is such a thing as overuse.
There are scientists who have done the analyses and predict that you could reduce fertilizers by about 12% without reducing crop production and see a significant decrease in the amount of nitrogen going into the Mississippi River.
Experts say the first key to changing behavior is raising public awareness.
We all live downstream of somebody, and we all live upstream of somebody. So what somebody else does in their watershed affects the water that I receive, and what I do in my watershed affects the water that somebody else receives downstream.
If we don't clean up our act, our water resources, which we simply cannot live without, will be ruined. Coming up, can the water supply for 9 million New Yorkers be saved from the ravages of polluted runoff? In January of 1996, one of the most devastating winter storms in history slams the East Coast. 2 feet of snow dumps on New York and throughout the Northeast Corridor. Schools, airports, and roads are shut down. By the time it's over, the blizzard and resultant flooding caused $3 billion in losses, and 187 lives are taken. And in the Catskill Mountains of upstate New York, the snowmelt triggers another potentially devastating crisis. Stormwater runoff, contaminated with trash, dirt, fertilizers, and pesticides from nearby farms and communities, threatens the fresh water supply. And the Catskill system of reservoirs is vitally important, for it is the biggest watershed of New York City, providing drinking water to over 9 million people.
The miracle of the city's water supply system is largely unknown to most New Yorkers. You ask people, where does the water come from? Often people shrug their shoulders and say New Jersey.
I figured that we were probably our own separate water system than from upstate. I'd rather be drinking water from upstate than the Hudson River.
I don't know that most people are aware of how large the problem is and how close to crisis many of our water supply systems are.
To preserve the purity of the reservoirs and enforce the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Environmental Protection Agency presented the Big Apple with two options. Either build and maintain a $6 billion facility to filter all of the city's tap water, or fund a $1 billion program to protect the watershed from polluted runoff.
When it comes to our investment in clean air and clean water, preserving open space, fixing antiquated sewage treatment plants, we can't wait. It doesn't get any less expensive, it gets more expensive.
With the historic Watershed Agreement of 1997, an unprecedented upstate-downstate partnership was forged to protect the New York City water supply.
The Watershed Agreement is saving New York City billions of dollars.
The plan includes purchasing and preserving 355,000 acres of undeveloped watershed land, the upgrading of sewage treatment plants, and the protection and restoration of stream corridors.
What we're looking at here is a main tributary of the Esopus Creek. During flooding, we were seeing a lot of sediment coming out of the stream. The clay gets into the water column and it becomes very turbid, and then it makes it very difficult to treat and clean that water. So from a water quality perspective, we're very concerned about erosion.
The program also provides funding for farmers that implement agriculture management practices.
Well, we have a very exciting program with the Watershed Agricultural Council where we are working with local farmers. We look at how they're handling the animals so that the runoff associated with manure, fertilizer, and that farm activity isn't getting into the streams around our reservoirs.
This water here is basically the water you're going to be drinking down in the city. And I feel I've got a responsibility to try my best to keep it clean for when it gets down there. It used to be when it rained here on the farm, the water that ran away from the back of the barn here was full of mud, manure, and it would just run brown and right into the stream. 2 years ago, we would spread every day. We'd have to take it out, spread it on the fields. If the snow was deep, we spread it on the snow, and unfortunately, if the ground was froze when the snow melted, the nutrient value of it for fertilizer was gone. It wound up down in the reservoir.
With New York City funding, a secure above-ground steel tank that can hold 400,000 gallons of manure was installed on the Meadowbrook farm.
That's enough storage for 6 months of the year. Now we can store it, spread it when it'll do the most good to us for fertilizer, and we don't have to spread it every day.
I worked with Tim on the plan to develop the improvements we're going to make. Plan really belongs to the farmer. And it's a collaboration of their ideas and what technical advice we can bring to the program. But the farmer makes the decision.
It's a program that seems to make everybody happy.
Here's to the farmers who are working so hard to make sure we've got clean water to put in our coffee.
To guarantee the city's water supply is fresh at the tap, comprehensive tests are performed by the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, both in the lab and at over 1,000 sampling stations throughout the city.
New York City has probably one of the most extensive water quality monitoring programs in the nation, if not the world.
We're sampling every day, 365 days a year. I've been drinking this water for 53 years. Nothing else. Best water in the world. New York City, straight from the tap to my lips.
Coming up, the future of our water supply remains at risk, but there's something everyone can do to help protect it. Find out how next. To keep our watersheds free of pollutants will require the actions of every citizen, community, and business.
Paved concrete surfaces, asphalt, parking lots, sidewalks. The question is, do we need to have as many as we do? Because to the extent that you have too much impervious surface, the water is not retained on site. It doesn't soak into the ground. It runs off, picks up speed, carries pollutants and contaminants into the water body.
One strategy for preventing stormwater runoff is occurring at the new Ford Rouge Center in Dearborn, Michigan. This remodeled truck plant is covered by a green roof the size of 8 football fields. Planted with a porous ground cover, it reduces the amount of polluted runoff released into the watershed.
The thing that tends to get the most attention is the 10-acre green roof. But that's really just part of a philosophy that if an area does not have to be paved or built upon, it's going to be green space.
And communities are also implementing green space strategies, such as rain gardens.
They sloped the lot in such a manner that all the flow goes towards this landscaping, where basically the polluted runoff can percolate into the ground and get filtered rather than going straight onto the street, into the storm drain system. and really a very simple approach to cleaning up our runoff in urban areas.
But perhaps the most powerful course of action is individual participation.
People need to take responsibility for the state of our waters, and water conservation is one area where they can do that as a committed citizen. All those things your mom told you, take a short shower, don't let the water tap run while you're brushing your teeth.
Taking your household hazardous waste to a cleanup and recycling day. Don't wash your car on the streets and put all those suds down into the drain.
When you change your used motor oil, you don't dump it into the street. Everybody's got to clean up after their pets. Obviously, that's a big concern. Fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, and make sure you don't use them anytime there's any chance of rain coming up in the near future. When you're irrigating your lawn and your garden, make sure that you're not overspraying and causing all those chemicals to end up getting into the storm drain system. The only way we're going to solve the problem is if everybody does their part.
We all live in a watershed. We all have an impact on our environment. And we must all play a role in the protection and restoration of our valuable water resources. To learn more about how you can get involved and to get a free brochure called After the Storm, visit epa.gov/Weather Channel.
Dr. Gates, tell me a little bit about the timeliness of the Reconstruction series. Why now?
12 years of black freedom, followed by an alt-right rollback. A president immediately following Abraham Lincoln who refused to renounce white supremacy. A conservative Supreme Court that effectively undid the power of the 14th and 15th Amendments. What's that sound like?
Contemporary times.
Contemporary times. So it was obvious that we could teach our fellow citizens in America about the perilous moment in which we're living by analogy through telling the story of Reconstruction and its rollback. And I first started thinking about it after the horrible murders of Reverend Clementa Pinckney and the other innocents at Mother Emanuel Church, because the justifications that Dylann Roof summoned for his actions were very reminiscent of racist rhetoric about black people immediately following the Civil War and following Reconstruction. And I was shocked. It's almost like a horror movie when you think that the vampire's dead and all of a sudden they come up out of the casket and you think, damn, I thought I put a stake in your heart. I thought that the worst and most pernicious and heinous aspects of anti-black white supremacy were long gone, and I was naive about that. And we've seen a rise in hate speech, anti-Semitism, anti-gay attitudes, and when people become frightened, particularly about their economic future, they look for scapegoats. And the scapegoats traditionally have been Jewish people, women, gay people, and of course in this country, people of color. So it's a moral, a lesson. Let's don't go back to what happened with the rollback to Reconstruction.
Reconstruction is such an important part of American history, and yet it is so misunderstood. Why is that? Why is it that we don't have a better understanding of this period and what it actually meant?
Well, W.E. Du Bois wrote a book in 1935 called Black Reconstruction. And one chapter is called The Propaganda of History. And he analyzes how white historians had written about Reconstruction. And that was part of the rollback, to create a mythology of black incompetence, that black men had been elected to office and couldn't properly serve, that black voters had been manipulated by northern scallywags and carpetbaggers. Basically, they were tools and pawns, that they were dishonest. Robert Smalls, who was one of the greatest heroes of the Civil War and Reconstruction, served 5 non-consecutive terms in Congress because he was constantly being accused yet of stealing money and misappropriating funds. There was a mythology sanctioned by the discipline of history located at Columbia University called the Dunning School, led by historian Professor Dunning. And they found every way to traduce the achievements of black people. And that has only been undone by historians since Du Bois published Black Reconstruction, and most notably under the leadership of another Columbia professor, Professor Eric Foner, with whom we made our Reconstruction series. He was our chief consultant. Plus, we have over 40 historians doing modern, cutting-edge scholarship on Reconstruction, whom we feature in the series. So it's very much a collective series.
Actually. We're back from executive session, having taken no action. Do I have a motion for adjournment?
I moved. Second.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you so much.